Hello everybody, welcome back to Inspirational Landscapes. In this section of the module, which we call On the Road, we're going to be exploring a number of different settings in which we can encounter some of the big issues that we've introduced already earlier on in the module, and we're going to try and add some detail and some variety to our viewpoints on those different issues. It's also a good title because there's a very famous book called On the Road, which is relevant to this module. If you've never encountered that before, then that's something that you might want to look up and find out a little bit about. Now, from what we've talked about already in the previous sessions, I hope that it's becoming clear to you that one of the key point of this module is that if we see things from different perspectives, if we encounter something or look at something or explore something from a different point of view, we notice different things about it. We see more in it. And once we start seeing these different things and these additional things within our viewpoint, then we start thinking of different things as being important about whatever it is that we're considering. That's why different people have different opinions about the world, because they're seeing it from different points of view. And conflicts often arise because people can't appreciate each other's different points of view. So there's a great deal of merit in exploring different ways of looking at the same thing, seeing the same thing from multiple points of view, and trying to notice in things what other people from different perspectives will be noticing within it. And that really is the key point of this module, to see landscape, to see geography, to see the world around us from different perspectives, from different points of view, notice more in the world around us, and realise that different things can be important depending on where we're looking from. So we see a landscape differently if we see it from a different point of view. You see the ground differently, for example, if you look at it from an airplane or if you look at it from a boat offshore. You see the air differently if you're on the ground looking up at it, or if you're in a plane flying through it, or if you're in a glider, if you're a bird flying through the air. Then different things about the air become important because of the way that you're interacting with it and because of the position from which you're looking at it. It isn't that one or other thing about the air or the sea or the land is important. What's important depends on your point of view, your perspective. And what you see, what you notice, what matters depends on where you're looking from. And so we're going to be trying to look at things from different positions, different points of view. Now, we've already said that achieving that new perspective, getting somewhere from where you can look at things from this different point of view, that can be hard. And it can be hard, for example, just psychologically. Remember we talked previously about what Marcel Proust in Search for Lost Time. He talks about habit and the fact that we get used to seeing things in certain ways. And it's very difficult to break out of those habitual ways of seeing things, habitual ways of thinking about the world. It can also be physically or logistically hard. It's all very well me saying, well, if you go and stand on top of a mountain and you look down at the world around you, it will look very differently from how it looks when you're down at the level of the valley bottom. Well, you've got to get yourself up to the top of that mountain. This is actually one of my favourite photographs from my various trips to Greenland in the past. And in a way, it's a very mundane day-to-day photograph. But it was actually taken on a very difficult trek across a glacier. And it's it reminds me of a particular moment, a particular viewpoint where I had a particular perspective on the world around me at that time. So there are psychological or emotional difficulties in forcing ourselves to see the world differently, but also practical difficulties in achieving the positions from where we can have those viewpoints. So it isn't necessarily straightforward having these different perspectives. It isn't as trivial to do as it is perhaps to say that we should be doing it. So how can we achieve these new perspectives? And you'll remember from a previous session I waved this book at you, The Lonely Planet Guide to Experimental Travel. Well, this is one of the things that you could do. You could try some of the exercises in there. Or you remember in Rebecca Solnit's Field Guide to Getting Lost. We talked in there, I read you something from there where she talked about Walter Benjamin's idea of losing ourselves in a city or in an environment. So there are activities that we can undertake, or approaches that we can follow, or situations that we can put ourselves into that force us to have a new perspective. For example, there's on this slide here, there's the 4 numbers exercise. Try doing this just now. Pick 4 numbers. The first number should be between 0 and 10, the second number between 0 and 9, your third number between 0 and 7, and your fourth number between 0 and 9. Then organise those numbers in the format x point y and y point z. So for example, if you pick the numbers 9, 8, 7 and 6, well then your outcome will be 9.8 and 7.6. So you use the 4 numbers to make 2 numbers with decimal points in the middle. And what you then do is move to our next slide. And you can see it's a map where I've marked off the bottom grid and the side grid with those numbers. So you can find on that map, and to a lot of you watching this video, that will be a very familiar location around the Keele University. So find on that map the positions of the points that you identified. So if your points were, I can't remember what we said now, but suppose we said 7.8 and 4.6. Well, 7.8 and 1, 2, 3, 4.6 would put you up here somewhere in Silverdale. Go there, go to that point on the map. Now you can do this obviously for your local area, wherever you are. Generate some random numbers, match them up to the grid references on a map of your local area, and go to that location, or get a couple of locations and follow the shortest route that you can between them on the ground. And the idea of this is it sends you to places that you maybe haven't been before. On this map of Keele, well, lots of you watching this will be very, very familiar with certain areas there, the university, the middle of Newcastle under Lyme maybe, and the routes between the two, and maybe where you live in your digs around campus, or whatever it might be. But I'm sure there will be other spots on that map that you've never been and you have no idea about. Well, if you can force yourself to have to go to one of those spots, well, that's a way of discovering things that you hadn't discovered before. So we talked about that previously. That was one of the examples, if you like, of a way of achieving some new point of view or some new perspective, or just getting yourself lost in an environment. So that's fairly straightforward, and that's something that maybe you've done since we had that lecture where we talked about it. Now, there's actually a big geographical literature about exactly that kind of thing. For example, even just about walking. I said you could go to, identify 2 locations on that map and then walk the route between them. Or some of the other exercises in the experimental travel book are things like head out of your front door, turn left, turn right, turn second left, turn second right, turn left, turn right. And some mechanical route driving process that sends you to new locations. You might think, that's just some silly game we could play. Well, yeah, it is, but it's also a thing in geography. And for this module, that's one of the important things that you need to be doing. For example, when you head towards your project, it isn't just a case of thinking, oh yeah, I'll go for a walk and report what I see. Well, yeah, but you need to do that in the context of this previously existing geographical literature. So never forget that whatever you're picking to do your project on, there almost certainly is a geographical literature. And one of your first jobs is to go out there and to find that and to relate your project work into that literature. So that's one example of how we could achieve a new perspective. What about some other ways you could do it? Well, my example number 2 here, if you like. Example number 2 would be to immerse yourself in somebody else's report of their adventures, their exploration. At its simplest, go and read Fridtjof Nansen's book about his expeditions in the North Polar regions, or anybody else's description of their adventures in some other location. Basically, you vicariously re-experience this exploration, this discovery, by seeing somebody else's version of it. Go and watch a movie about someone's explorations, or go and find some documentaries about discovering, exploring areas that you've never been to before. So that's a second example that you might follow. A third example, developing on the previous 2 a little bit, would be not just to read about somebody else's historical adventures, but to actually recreate those for yourself. So read about somebody's exploration of some area that you can realistically get to, and then go there yourself, follow in their footsteps. That's a great exercise to do, but one of the things that you'll discover is that if you go to somewhere that this previous explorer went to and found it very exciting, they had all their adventures, when you go there, try as you may, you're not going to become that person. You're not going to have the same experiences. You will inevitably be yourself albeit in that new location, and trying to see it through the eyes of those previous people. You can stand in those people's shoes, but you can't actually be those people, and it's inevitable that you will have your own experience of that adventure, not somebody else's experience. It's very difficult to genuinely see through somebody else's eyes. But my fourth example then of how you might achieve these new perspectives, if none of those previous ones are doing it for you, is actually to look at the world from a genuinely new point of view, somewhere that you've never been before, or some perspective from which you've never thought previously. Difficult to get there, but here's an example. Travel into space. Not really practical for most of us, but here's an interesting case study. This is the overview effect, and it's a documentary video and book, and you can look this up online. But it's about as it says there, the perspective altering effect of seeing Earth from space. Remember, right at the beginning of the module we talked about the dark side of the moon. We said, well, you can't see it from the Earth, but more importantly, you can't see the Earth from there. And we tried placing ourselves on the dark side of the moon and imagining what we'd see, and we could be there for millions, thousands of millions of years, and we'd never see the Earth because that side of the moon is always turned away from the Earth. But can we imagine ourselves into that position? Well, what if we're not actually imagining it? What if we could go out into space and not just be looking at the moon from space, but turn around and look at the Earth from space? It isn't that long since somebody did that for the first time, and these photographs that we're now very familiar with of the Earth from space, when that first happened, it was such a moment in the history of our appreciation of our place in the universe. Now there's a documentary video here that I'm going to ask you to go and watch. You can either pause me now and go and watch that video, or there's only a couple more slides and then I'll stop, and after I finish, go away, and the next thing I'd like you to do is have a look at this overview effect video, at least the first 9 or 10 minutes of it. Watch the whole thing if you're interested, but watch at least the first 9 or 10 minutes of it before we then carry on with our next bit of video. But it's all about seeing ourselves from a new perspective. Remember T.S. Eliot? Never cease from exploration. When we, at the end of all our exploration, is to know ourselves for the first time. The whole point of exploration is to see ourselves, look back at ourselves from these new places. And when you've seen things from a different point of view, it isn't just you've seen something different. Because of that new perspective that you've achieved, you yourself are changed. We talk about people's viewpoint changing. Well, your views, your attitudes, what makes you you changes as a result of that new viewpoint that you've had. You're also changed. And because of what you've seen changing you, well, you can then begin to define yourself perhaps, and this is something we can think about as we move forward into the course. Is it that you are what you are because of what you've seen? As people always say, oh, you are what you are because of what you've done. Well, yeah, but it's also because of what you've seen from the places that you've got yourself to. The perspectives, the visions, the viewpoints that you've had, the different perspectives. Proust with his 1,000 different universes, 1,000 different sets of eyes can see. The more of those experiences and perspectives that you get, then that changes what you are yourself. And that's kind of what the bit of video I'd like to watch here about the overview effect. That's what that is all about. Now, whenever I see the overview effect video, I'm always reminded of a particular poem by Mervyn Peake. And this poem, excuse me, this poem is called Suddenly Walking Along the Open Road. And I've put a few lines of it there I'll just read it out for you. Suddenly, walking along the open road, I felt afraid. I saw the stars, and the world beneath my feet became a planet, and I was no longer in Wiltshire. I was standing upon the surface, the edge of a planet that runs around the sun. I was in danger. For all the comfort of the elms, the banal normality of the houses with their garages, the apparent changelessness of the ploughed field on my right, all was in danger. A marble spinning through the universe wears on its dizzy crust men, houses, trees that circle through cavernous eons, and I was afraid. So what this poem is doing is just, he's saying, well, there I was sitting in my shed, minding my own business, walking along a country lane in Wiltshire, and suddenly he had this change of perspective. He had this overview effect, essentially is what he's describing, that suddenly he sees himself in this big context of the universe. normally we see ourselves in the context of kind of human scale things that are around us. That's very comfortable for us. But just occasionally you get this flash, this shot, this image of yourself in the context of everything. Now there's a term that we're going to come back to and spend a lot of time talking about later in the module, which is the sublime, which some of you might have come across before, which is an aspect of how we can see the world around us at that grand, terrifying, awesome scale of the universe pitted against our own tiny size. Mervyn Peake, there's another Mervyn Peake poem in which he talks about our pitiful return to those small things we are the masters of. We feel comfortable with these small things that we can control and that are at our scale, but always behind us there's this big framework of the scale of the universe within which we're tiny. Now there's another example that I'd like to I say introduce you to. You're probably familiar with this already. This is Douglas Adams' A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series, and in particular a book called The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. And in this book, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, Douglas Adams talks about something called the total perspective vortex. And it's basically a machine, and you go into this machine and you get plugged into it. On one end of the wires plug into you at one end, and they plug you in through the machine to a piece of fairy cake. But from this piece of fairy cake, the machine extrapolates to what the universe, the whole of the universe must be like. And it shows you, based on this extrapolation from a piece of cake, it shows you the whole universe and you in the context, in comparison to that whole size. So there's this juxtaposition of the human scale and the landscape scale or the cosmic scale. And the idea, a bit like the Mervyn Peake poem or the overview effect, the idea is it's very difficult for us to see ourselves, it's very painful for us to see ourselves as so tiny in that massive context. And I'm always struck, I don't know if this was deliberate on Douglas Adams' part, I've never read anything about this, I'm not sure. But if you've looked up about Proust, as I suggested you might do previously, and we'll talk about Proust again later on of course, but the whole basis of the Proust book, this massive Proust novel, is that he goes for a cup of tea with his aunt and he dips his piece of cake in his tea and he tastes it. And the taste of that cake, a madeleine, a kind of cakey biscuit dipped in the tea, it's that, what he calls involuntary memory, that's brought up suddenly, but that taste just gives him a flashback to the past. And that flashback is essentially the starting point. It's 100 pages in, but it's basically the starting point for the whole rest of the story. So to some extent, the madeleine that gives Proust his involuntary memory, which sparks off this massive novel, to me is a very similar thing to the piece of fairy cake in the total perspective vortex, because it does the same thing. It puts you into that much larger framework or much larger context. And when we're going to talk about Western movies as an example of interpretations of landscape later on in the module, and one of the characteristic scenes in every Western movie pretty much is small figures in a big landscape, just to put to show the context of the human scale against the landscape scale. So this is a big important issue that we're beginning to talk about here. So what I've said in the last few minutes is just that if you engage with landscape in different ways, and at different scales is one of those different ways that you can use. But if you engage with landscapes in different ways, for example, at different scales, then you notice different things. And that's what I want you to be doing right now. So go and have a look at that overview effect video, and then just go outside, go and explore, do some exercises from the book, or do that 4 numbers exercise that I gave you earlier on. Try to put yourself in different positions, see the world from different perspectives, and try to notice more. But as you're beginning to do that, I say, your next job, go away, have a look at that overview effect video, and then we'll carry on developing these ideas in our next instalment of Inspirational Landscapes.